We're so happy to have you here. I want to thank the incredible Abby Suckle for bringing you all here today. Thank you so much for organizing this wonderful event. Thanking CultureNOW and the Lower Manhattan Historical Association, and of course the wonderful roster of speakers that we have here for you today. So before I hand the microphone over to Abby, I want to remind all of you to please take out your cell phones and mute them, please. I just want to make sure that all of our speakers are able to give their talks going uninterrupted. We do have a docent-led tour after the talk here today at 3 o'clock. So once you're done listening to all the wonderful things that our speakers have to say, learn a little bit more about the history of the museum at Eldridge Street by joining our docent-led tour. And now I want to pass the mic along to Abby Suckle, and once again, thank you all for being here today, and thank you, of course, Abby.
My name is Abby Suckle, and I wear several hats. The first is I'm Vice President of the Lower Manhattan Historical Association, but I'm also president of an organization called CultureNOW. And we are organizing It Happened Here. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it turns out that over 1,000 events that took place that impacted our city, our state, and our country all have a connection to Lower Manhattan. And when we did the research, we were completely shocked to find out that that many significant events happened here. This was the first capital of our nation for 2 years. This is where the Bill of Rights was. This is where George Washington got inaugurated. And so there's a lot of history. As you know, the 250th anniversary of our country and the 400th of our city is coming up. Our city's 400th, which is actually a date that was decided to be in 1625 by one of our previous mayors, is now on our city seal. So this will be the 400th anniversary next year. It occurred to us that we could celebrate both events at the same moment in time. So we are going to compress all of the 400 years of New York and the fact that most of it occurs in this neighborhood into a 5-day festival next year, July 4th. Now, you can't do a 5-day festival on July 4th without telling a lot of people and practicing. So we saw Bridgerton and we decided we would have prequels. And this is one of our prequels. Our friends at the Museum at Eldridge Street were happy to lend their space and their expertise so that we could have a prequel symposium event to talk about what actually happened in the Lower East Side, in this place, this synagogue, and how transformative it was for the cultural history of not only our country, but the Jewish community here. So that's what today is going to be about. And we've invited speakers who had the good fortune to know a lot and be available on a Sunday afternoon in the summer, which, as you know, is difficult. Our first speaker is Bob Snyder, who is our borough historian. And with that, I will invite him to the lectern.
In the early 1980s, when I was a graduate student in history at NYU, I was fascinated by the history of immigration and the history of New York City. And to understand both, I made repeated trips into the Lower East Side. I walked past dumbbell tenements, abandoned buildings, old St. Patrick's Cathedral, settlement houses, and the old home of the Jewish Daily Forward. It was on one of those trips that I discovered the Eldridge Street Synagogue. I poked around, and an elderly man, a Sexton, who I recall as being named Mr. Markowitz, let me in. I walked into the sanctuary that you're sitting in today, and I was awestruck. At one, it was still a magnificent space, but it was also almost seemingly in ruin. It looked like I had discovered a vanished civilization. And a question nagged at me. How did this happen? How did a building built to be permanent and a congregation with the resources and motivation to create this magnificent edifice change so much in roughly 50 years? Less than one lifetime. The story of how that happened and how the building was restored to the beautiful state that we see today is all part of a larger history of immigration, religion, the Lower East Side, New York City, and historic preservation. You'll learn more about all of these today in the presentations that will follow. What I want to offer is two pairs of thoughts to keep in mind when we think about the history of Lower Manhattan, especially the Lower East Side, and how they help us understand New York City and the history of the United States. One, keep in mind the sacred and the secular. Two, keep in mind continuity and change. New York is a city of many religions because it is a city of immigrants, and secular economic factors powerfully shaped who came here and when. When immigrants came here, they came here because of New York's dynamic economy that offered them a chance to start life over again in a new place with better opportunities. Immigrants might value the religious freedoms they found in New York City and the United States, but often they had to struggle to make their new home a place that would accept religious differences. Roman Catholic and Jewish immigrants in particular, who were prominent in New York City from the middle of the 19th century on, played important roles in making the city and the United States more accepting of religions beyond Protestantism. The connection between immigration and religion is marked on the landscape here in Lower Manhattan. Start at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. You're in a Protestant church shaped by both the British Empire and the American Revolution. Walk east and north from there, and you'll cross the site of the old African burial ground. Walk further east, and you'll come to the cemetery of Congregation Shearith, Israel, at 55 James Street, a graveyard for Sephardic Jews. Double back to the north, go to 29 Mott Street, and you're at the Roman Catholic Church of the Transfiguration, housed in a church built for German Lutherans. Ghetto, when immigrant Eastern European Jews lived there in the early 1900s. Lower East Side, when Puerto Ricans settled in there in the 60s and 70s. And Alphabet City, for Avenue A eastward, when realtors prepared the neighborhood for gentrification in the 1980s. In Lower Manhattan, where we meet the competing pressures of the past and the present, a sense of history helps us get perspective, gives us a sense of proportion, and a sense of where recent changes have brought us. When I first explored the Lower East Side in the 1980s, I saw abandoned buildings and an open-air heroin market not far north of here. The Jewish immigrants who built this synagogue at the end of the 19th century had long since left, leaving behind only a remnant of their community. Today, in a way that I could never have imagined in 1980, the defining issues in this part of Manhattan are gentrification and economic inequality. People constantly bring them up whenever I do a public lecture. It doesn't matter what the topic of my lecture is, they'll finish by complaining about the rising cost of rents and the inability of an ordinary person to afford living in Manhattan. But if these problems sometimes seem insoluble, remember that there was a time in the 1980s when it was impossible to foresee the beautifully restored building that we're gathered in today to hear the excellent presentations that will follow. Thank you.
For those of you, probably the most famous document that established religious freedom in America was the Newport Letter, and there's a story behind it, and Seth Kaller has actually brought some of the historic documents with him, so I'm going to introduce him next. Welcome, Seth.
Before I talk, does anybody have a camera? Can you take a picture of me? I'm horrible at selfies. And the point of that is, you have a picture of me as a younger man. And all of your photographs are photographs of you as younger people. And I might as well start with that to tell you what the biggest problem that I have with history. Too many people think that history is about the past. And sure, that's interesting, but I really care about the future. And that's why I'm going to talk about George Washington's most famous letter in a way that deals with things that I swore I wouldn't talk about, like politics. For instance, the idea of originalism. If you think of what we hear about originalism, it's what were the founders thinking when they wrote things like the Declaration or the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, which might be slightly more famous than this in terms of religious freedom, but no more important. But before you get bored with hearing from me, let me just start by speaking on behalf of George Washington. I'm going to read his letter, and then I'll comment on it a bit. Since you probably can't see this, I won't point. Normally, I like to read it and point to it, but I'll just start. This is the letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. And the trick, of course, is that people think that it was written there, but it was written here in New York, responding to the address that he got when he was in Newport a couple days earlier. So, to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, gentlemen, while I receive with much satisfaction your address, replete with expressions of affection and esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always retain a grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I received in my visit to Newport from all classes of citizens. The reflection on the days of difficulty and danger which are past is rendered the more sweet from a consciousness that they are succeeded by days of uncommon prosperity and security. If we have wisdom to make the best use of the advantages with which we are now favored, we cannot fail, under the just administration of a good government, to become a great and happy people. I should steal that line. Anyway, the citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess a like liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. Before I repeat the next line, I'll say that Washington had this great, great habit that today we might call plagiarism. But actually, more charitably, he's calling back the best things that are said to him or written to him. So when I read the phrase, "to bigotry, no sanction," you should know that it wasn't Washington's invention. It was actually written to him and spoken to him in the address of Moses Seixas on behalf of the Jewish congregation in Newport, and see what he does with it. I may have read this line, but it's worth repeating. I'll go back. "All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character now, not to avow that I'm pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercy scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way, everlastingly happy. George Washington." First of all, he has a couple of neat tricks, besides the calling back, taking the greatest letters sent to him. So there's another famous letter that he wrote to the synagogue in Savannah, which is a really good letter. But of the 21 letters to religious congregations that he wrote, responding to their addresses in the first 2 years of his presidency, I would say this is the best, and the one to the Roman Catholics, I think, is the second best, both because of the strength of the addresses given to him. But let me point out one other little trick that he does that is useful. He is constantly looking at the issue and expanding it. So he starts by talking about citizens and then goes to inhabitants. He starts by addressing the Jewish congregation and then goes to the children of the stock of Abraham. He starts by answering the specific question, which really was an address about, in this new country, are Jews going to be included in the political fabric? And he paints this picture that I would say is the best example of authentic originalism that we should be looking to today. This is an example of a government that is here on behalf of the people, and everything else, religion, place of origin, where you live, your particular natural talents, and even though he had the blinders that wouldn't allow him to see, based on the time that he lived in, that women and that people of color, or back then slaves, now African Americans, or citizens of any country, they're all included once they're here. Everything else is friction, to use the word that we would use today, in terms of what our government should be. And so widening the picture of religious freedom, which back then was an issue really of faith, there are two parts to it. There's your own faith and your desire to practice it, and there's the desire of other people to practice their faiths, but unfortunately, throughout history, that often entails the imposition of one faith upon every other. And while Washington and the other founders were men of faith, they were really wary about imposing their particular brand of faith on others. So even in Newport, Rhode Island, when all of the churches got together to give one address to George Washington, and in 1790, there wasn't another place in the world where that would have happened than in America. And even then, because the Jewish congregation was not included, they were allowed the same right that everybody else had, and they didn't just send him a letter, they gave him a public address. So the address was to him publicly. He said, thank you. They give it to him in a copy, in a letter. He comes back to New York, and that's where this reply was sent, down on Wall Street, possibly at Federal Hall, or in his home down there. So there's that New York connection, as there are so many others, to religious freedom in America. This is where the Bill of Rights was crafted. This is where it was sent out for signing. But also, I'll go back just a couple years before this to a document that we still hear a lot about, the US Constitution. And let me just suggest that if you're thinking about the Constitution at all, read George Washington's cover letter that he sent with it, which isn't published today very often with the Constitution, but back then, everywhere the Constitution was published, it was published with the cover letter, because at that time he's in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention, which has no power. Congress is in New York, so as soon as they finish writing the Constitution, they have to send it to Congress in New York, and they do it with two cover letters, one that explains just their idea of ratification, and the other, I think, is on par with this, the greatest example of what government is and what originalism should be. It's his discussion about compromise. It's his discussion about liberty. And you can't have liberty without giving up a share of liberty. And he describes the hardest part, the hardest challenge that government has is deciding which liberty must be surrendered in order to preserve the greatest liberty. And that is what changes over time. And that's why, as I started by saying, I really don't care as much about the past as I do about the future. But he has left us with a perfect vision that they were not ready for back in 1790. Just like Thomas Jefferson, the greatest part of the Declaration of Independence is the biggest problem with the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And we hear that today and we think, these guys didn't mean that. Actually, they did. Their reality wouldn't allow them to think of women being included or blacks being included back then, but they actually meant it. And when you get to inherent natural rights, you know, almost 250 years later, we've learned enough to know, hey, women are actually human beings. People of other religions are actually human beings. People born of other races, if race actually exists, are human beings. Inherent natural rights are not government-given rights. And that is the basis of real freedom of faith, real freedom of religion. And I would argue that that's actually what the founders, and especially George Washington, gave us for the future. So while we should be well aware of all of the problems, all of the things that they did wrong, all of the moral compromises, some of which were moral and some of which were immoral, but we should think that now that we're not trapped in their day and age, they were not creating a government that shackled us to the past. They were creating a path for us to go forward. And the reason that I have the letter now, and unfortunately I wasn't able to take the original, but we are looking for a place in New York that has the right security and environmental protection to be able to show it. It had been seen as Washington's greatest letter combating anti-Semitism, which it is, and it had been shown in Jewish museums particularly. And now I think it's time to realize that what Washington is saying about anti-Semitism, without using the word, about how tolerance isn't enough and fighting bigotry isn't enough. We need to start with a new baseline of just considering human beings with their inherent natural rights and building from there. So I'm looking for institutional partners to show this letter and to take it and explain that when you're fighting anti-Semitism, you should be fighting all sorts of bigotry. And this kind of letter, and even our founders' words, those hypocritical, dead white, misogynistic men, actually have something great to tell us about a future and an American tapestry that is built on our unique, inherent natures. So, thank you.
Well, that's a perfect segue into our next speaker, who's Zach Edinger from Shearith, Israel, who will take us from 1653 on.
It is really, really great to be in this beautiful, beautiful synagogue and to participate in this amazing event. Today, my aim is to describe and to contextualize the foundation of New York's Jewish community, because it was the establishment of this very small Jewish community in lower Manhattan in the Dutch colonial period and its growth during the British colonial period that led to an integration of Jews in the American experiment, in the American dream. And that journey resulted in a completely new and uniquely American Judaism, which made New York City an attractive place for Jews to settle in later periods. Without this foundational period, who knows if New York would later become the Golden Medina, where Jews in Europe would rush to. Without the earliest settlement of Jews here in 1654, perhaps some other port city would have looked more desirable to those escaping oppression in the Old World. This talk aims to explore the early Jewish settlements in Dutch and British colonial New York, highlighting the challenges and triumphs of this community, and it will shed light on the struggle for religious and civil rights, the role of key figures in advocating for those freedoms, and the enduring impact that these early settlers had on the broader fabric of American society. By examining the historical evolution of the Jewish community in New York, we hope to understand how a small, mostly Sephardic settlement in New Amsterdam paved the way for the rich and diverse Jewish culture that characterizes New York City today. We will begin with the origins of the first settlement of Jews in Dutch New Amsterdam in 1654, move on to the British colonial period, where the rights that were fought for during the Dutch period are actually realized and expressed in earnest, and finally, we will briefly examine the changing identity of American Jewry as Jews took part in the War of Independence and how this affected Jewish identity in the early Federalist period. To begin with, we have to go back to the early 17th century. Western Sephardim living in Amsterdam are overwhelming the economy of what the synagogue, the Sephardic synagogue, the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam can support. More and more B'nai Anusim, more and more of the converso Jews are escaping to come to Amsterdam. Why? Because Amsterdam is Protestant, they're at war with the Portuguese, they're at war with the Spanish. It's a natural ally for someone who has lived as a Catholic forcibly to escape to and re-Judaize. But there are not enough jobs, and there's not enough space. And so the community in Amsterdam starts to send people elsewhere. And the very first community in the New World where the Sephardic community of Amsterdam sends people to live is Recife, Brazil, in Pernambuco in the northern part of Brazil. That community begins around 1630. It has a life of its own, which we won't discuss today. Very successful life, but brief. Because in the year 1654, the Portuguese, who are in the southern part of Brazil, think Rio de Janeiro, take over the northern part of Brazil from the Dutch and give a 3-month amnesty for the Protestants and the Jews to leave, and then they're going to institute the Inquisition. This led to an exodus of nearly all the Dutch Protestants and all the Jews from Recife, most of whom returned to Amsterdam. One notable group ended up in a small fur trading colony known as New Amsterdam, marking a new chapter in Jewish history. In August of 1654, the first Jewish settlers arrived in the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, which was a tiny outpost primarily focused on fur trading under the Dutch West India Company. The top picture is what New Amsterdam Harbor looked like around 1650. A lot different than what you would look at today. The entire population of New Amsterdam was about 700, maybe 750 people. They all lived below Wall Street. Wall Street was a wall. So in August of 1654, to that small colony, The governor of that colony was Peter Stuyvesant, who's also pictured here. Arrived 3 Jews, or maybe 3 Jews, on a ship called the Pear Tree. Their names were Jacob Bar Simson, Solomon Peterson, and probably Asser Levy. They had arrived from Amsterdam. Asser Levy, however, had certainly lived in Recife, Brazil, or before coming to Amsterdam. He had left earlier, gone to Amsterdam, and then came to New Amsterdam. They were looking for trading. They didn't come with their families. They came individually. They were looking for trade. But 2 weeks after their arrival, just 2 weeks after their arrival, came another ship, usually called the St. Catherine, sometimes called the St. Charles. And on that ship were 23 Jews, along with Dutch Protestants. They had been the last refugees of Recife, Brazil, who had fled on the 16th ship leaving Recife. Unfortunately, they didn't make it to Amsterdam. They got shipwrecked in the Caribbean, or some say attacked by a Spanish privateer. No one exactly knows. They get stranded on an island in the West Indies and get rescued by a French frigate, sometimes known as the St. Catherine, sometimes known as the St. Charles. And that ship takes them to its next port of call, which happened to be New Amsterdam. These were not traders. These were men, women, and children. And their arrival immediately caused concern to the colony because they had lost all their possessions, or nearly so, in their flight from Recife. And so the very first record we have of them is in the courts, because the captain of the St. Catherine sues them for their fare. You've got to pay me for bringing you here. And they cannot pay the fare. And so who has to represent them? Solomon Peterson, Jacob Bar Simson, and Asser Levy, who had just arrived 2 weeks earlier, and were not really looking for such a role. Stuyvesant does not want them to settle in New Amsterdam. He wants them to leave and go back. And so he writes to the Dutch West India Company. But the Jews also write to the Dutch West India Company. In fact, the community of Amsterdam writes to the Dutch West India Company. And in fact, you can see here, although you can't really read it, a letter that was written from the Portuguese community in Amsterdam to the Dutch West India Company, which highlighted the fact that there were Jewish colonists in Recife who had supported that colony and lost great sums when it fell, that there were Jewish board members of the Dutch West India Company, that there were Jews who wanted to settle in all of the Dutch colonies in the Atlantic. So don't restrict us now. They also pointed out that the British permitted Jews to settle in Barbados, and the French allowed people to settle in Saint Dominique, in what we now call Haiti. So why would the Dutch do anything differently? And the Dutch West India Company accepted this plea and told Stuyvesant to permit the Jews to settle there. And that official permission came in 1655. And that's the first of many rights that had to be fought for. Stuyvesant was an all-around bigot. He did not want anyone, did not like anyone who was not part of the Dutch Reformed Church. And this begins a period of 2 or 3 years where every single right has to be fought for. Every single right to own property, to own a store, to become a burgher, to become a citizen of the city of New Amsterdam, to serve on the city watch instead of paying a tax, to trade with other parts of the colony or with Native Americans in Delaware. All of those rights were petitioned of Stuyvesant. He said no. They escalated it to the Dutch West India Company, who put down Stuyvesant and allowed the Jews to continue and to thrive. And that is the origin of Jewish settlement in New Amsterdam. That small community was overwhelmingly Portuguese, Sephardic, but not entirely, because those 3 traders who came originally, Jacob Bar Simson, Solomon Peterson, and Asser Levy, were almost assuredly Ashkenazic Jews. Most of the others that came were Portuguese, such as Bueno de Mesquita family, or De Lucena family, or Luzado, known as all Portuguese names that you would expect to find in a Portuguese Sephardic community. But what happens is 10 years later, the British come sailing down the Hudson River, and they, without firing a shot, take over the colony. New York actually trades hands between the British and the Dutch, I think more than once. And the Jews who had settled here in the Dutch period were quite concerned. None of them were British citizens. None of them were born in this colony. What rights would they have to trade? All of their livelihoods depended on their ability to trade and to engage in international shipping and with other colonies. And so they almost all leave, with very few exceptions. A man named Jacob Luzada stayed, and of course, most famously, Asser Levy stayed. But then that all gets settled in by the 1670s. You have the British take over, they trade Suriname to the Dutch trade New Amsterdam back to the British, who name it New York. And from that period on, Jewish settlement begins again. Why? Because the governor of New York at that time was named Edmund Andros, and he explicitly included the Jews in his guarantees of equal treatment, so that he assured all the Dutch residents, as well as the Jews, that they would have the same security as they had before and could trade again. They also could vote in elections, and theoretically at least could hold public office. These were notable advancements in their civil rights. But there was one thing that was not attained during the Dutch period, nor in the early British period, and that is complete religious freedom. They were not able to worship publicly. They were not able to have a synagogue. They had to worship in all quietness in their own homes. That didn't stop the Jewish community, however, from continuing. In 1682, despite the restriction of not having a synagogue, they purchased land for a cemetery. That cemetery still exists right here in Lower Manhattan. You can walk to 55 St. James Place, as mentioned by Rob, and you can see it today. We actually have ceremonies there once a year. It's also open by appointment. If you ever want to see what happened there, you can give me a call. 1695, there is no official permission for Jews to have a synagogue, yet in John Miller's map, a synagogue is placed there. They had rented a house and made it into a synagogue, despite their restrictions. By 1700, the synagogue is probably located on Mill Street, where in 1728, the community purchases land and builds the first purpose-built synagogue in America. They established communal functions such as a yeshiva to train the students in Jewish as well as secular studies called Minchat Areb. They employed a chazan. They ensured the provision of kosher meat by hiring a ritual slaughterer, a shochet. They built a mikveh in order for ritual laws to be upheld, ritual purity laws. All the things that a Jewish community would need, they provided, making the colony of New York acceptable for Jews to come from all over, and reflecting their commitment to maintaining religious traditions. That's the beginning of the British period. Many of the furnishings and furniture of that first synagogue, which was built in 1730, and even some from earlier periods, are still in use today at my synagogue at Shearith, Israel, which is now located on West 70th Street. And despite the increasing number of Ashkenazic Jews during the British colonial period, the congregation maintained its Portuguese ritual, as it does today. But one of the features of this period, as more and more Jews come to America, and I should say, when I say more and more Jews, this is all a relative term. All the Jews of New York, from the entire period that I'm talking about, from 1654 to 1825, could fit in this room. There were about 500 Jews in 1825 in New York. So we're not talking about a large community. But that small community had very mixed identities. They were Dutch, British, Portuguese, Sephardic, Ashkenazic. They were living in a colony. This confusion or multiplicity of identities comes out in several different ways. One place that you can see it very clearly is in our old cemetery. If you go to our old cemetery, you can look at the epitaphs, some of the most famous ones, some of the most prominent people in New York, someone like Moses Levy, has 3 languages on his epitaph: English, Hebrew, and Portuguese. He was not Portuguese. He was born in Germany, but he has Portuguese on his epitaph. If you were to go to synagogue services on the Sabbath, let's say, I'll pick a random year, 1775. Maybe not so random. You would hear, after the morning prayers, which were all done in Hebrew, a prayer for the government, made not in Hebrew, but in Portuguese. For who? King George III of England. Where? In New York. In New York, praying for the King of England in Portuguese in the synagogue by Ashkenazic Jews. The identities are very mixed up. At the same time as this confusion or multiplicity of identities, I also want to point out that this is the period, the British colonial period, that Jewish community becomes very, very entrenched. So the richest families in the community, the Gomezes, the Levies, the Franks, they are integrated in the highest echelons of New York society, something that was not so easy to do elsewhere. During the British period, Jewish craftsmen rose to prominence. For example, Meyer Myers became the leading and most sought-after silversmith in New York City during the late British colonial period, things that they could not have done in Amsterdam, say. The synagogue, which originally, when it was built, had to solicit funds from elsewhere, from London, Curacao, Suriname, Barbados, by the end of this period, is now wealthy enough to help other communities found their synagogues and helped contribute to the building of the Newport Synagogue in 1763. Or they're also able to contribute money to Israel. Emissaries from Israel start coming to New York to raise funds. That had not been in an earlier period. So the British period is one of transition from small to established. And those multiplicity of identities begin to change with the American Revolution. For by the time that the American Revolution comes around, I don't know why I'm still looking at my papers. I don't even know where I am. By the time the American Revolution comes around, there have been several generations. In fact, there were American-born members of the congregation, not only American-born members of the congregation, but the cantor, the minister, the chazan. Gershom Mendy Seixas was born right here in New York City. And that's significant because none of his predecessors would have ever dared to do what he did, which was to preach the American cause in the synagogue. His predecessors were all foreign-born. They would have stayed away from politics, but not Gershom Mendy Seixas. Now, that's not to say that the entire community was patriotic. There were families, such as the Hendricks and the Lazarus families and others, that were Tories and remained in New York through the entire Revolution. And there were services in the synagogue during the Revolution, probably not as frequently as before or after, but there was a community here. But for the most part, when the Continental Army loses the Battle of Long Island and flees up Washington Heights into Connecticut, the Jews go with him and spend the remainder of the war in Connecticut, in Philadelphia, coming back afterwards. When they come back, there is a palpable change, a noticeable change. That is, Portuguese is no longer used. By the way, you can see here on this picture, this is the minute book of the congregation from 1728. And while you can't really see it very carefully, this side is in English, this side is in Portuguese. Another example of the mixed identities the community had. After the Revolution, no more minutes being taken in Portuguese. Portuguese is dropped from the service, is in the ritual, and you never find epitaphs in Portuguese anymore. Why? Because they now identify as American Jews. They're not Portuguese Jews living in a British colony. They are American Jews. The prayer for the government is changed in form to reflect a Republican form of government. The Thanksgiving Day service is created by Gershom Mendy Seixas, one which we, for the most part, keep to this day. And the identity has changed. And this is significant because no other place in the entire world were Jews as closely integrated into the society as in America. Certainly not in 1776, certainly not in the early Federalist period after the Constitution. And the Jews appreciated that. So much so that you get characters. Probably the most famous Jew before the Civil War in America was a man named Mordecai Manuel Noah. And he's an interesting character. He came from mention him is because in 1825, he conceives of a new idea, that Jews should have a homeland, that they shouldn't be subject to the whims of princes and mobs in Europe and suffer the consequences of anti-Semitism, whether institutional or mob-led, and Jews should settle in the new homeland of where they could be free. And where did he conceive that homeland to be? Right here in America. Not in New York City, but in a small island south of Buffalo called Grand Island. Nobody wanted to go there, nobody came. But that's not the point. The point is that by 1825, Jews conceived of themselves as Americans, and that they recognized how much more freedom this country enabled them to granted to them, and how they were part of the society. And not only were, well, I guess we'll finish there because we're at 1825. And by 1825, more and more Jews were coming from Germany. More and more Jews were living further uptown. So the old synagogue that was located on Mill Street was feeling cramped. And the German Jews asked a pretty innocuous question. Could we have an early morning service for the Ashkenazic Jews in the Ashkenazic Rite? I won't tamper with your morning service at the regular time. We want to have an early morning service in the Ashkenazic Rite. And the board of trustees, who were mostly Ashkenazim of the synagogue of Shearith Israel in 1825, said, no, can't tamper with tradition, can't tamper with our rituals. And the Ashkenazic Jews said, sorry, we're going to go make our own synagogue. And that first breakaway was an Ashkenazic synagogue called B'nai Jeshurun. Still exists today on 88th Street. Shearith Israel still exists today on 70th Street. They've come a long way. They're still here. And that leads me to the conclusion of what I'm trying to explain here, which is that all the rights and all the benefits of this country, which were fought for hard in the Dutch period and were expanded in the British period, and which led Jews to appreciate their Americanness and to create the institutions that Jews would want to come to. That is what leads to later generations to come to America. When there is oppression in Europe, when there is oppression in Eastern Europe, this synagogue might never have been built had not those first generations created a community. And I want to close just by saying something about the It Happened Here series that Abby was referring to. Because everywhere you go in New York, something has happened there. And the reason that I was asked to speak here was because several years ago, I think it was 2019, could have been 2018, the Lower Manhattan Historical Association had an effort to rename South William Street as the Mill Street Synagogue, Gershom Mendy Way. And they contacted our synagogue. And they said, you want to be a part of this? And we're just like, oh, okay. We didn't really understand what it was, so we gave kind of lackluster support. We didn't really know who these people were or what they were trying to achieve. And I went to the first event. It was very nice. But I saw the plaque that they put up, and it said, Shearith Israel, finished in 1818. I said, no, we're still here today. We're just not down on Mill Street anymore. But there was a third synagogue, and a fourth synagogue, and a fifth synagogue. And then as I went the following years and they asked me to actually speak, I understood what they were trying to achieve, which was that everywhere you turn in New York, there is history to be found. So if you're walking in Lower Manhattan, you can walk on the place where the first synagogue in America was, and how are you going to know about that if not for plaques and name changes and virtual museums like CultureNOW. And so with that, I would just like to thank everyone for attending, and I hope that I've given you a little bit of perspective on later immigration and how the foundations of New York Jewish community began. Thank you very much.
We have an exceptionally thorough afternoon, and Scott Brevda is going to now share with you this beautiful space that you happen to be enjoying right now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am the Senior Manager for Education and Accessibility here, and it's oftentimes on tours or school programs and other events that I have to distill this building, the history and its history, along with the history of this neighborhood into about 1 hour. It's not as easy as it looks. For in keeping with this theme of this event today, a lot happened here. I'm continuing, of course, the story of those that spoke before me about the Jewish experience here in New York, but I'm also speaking about this period of the Lower East Side between about 1880 to 1890. For in that period, one of the great waves of immigration would come to New York City in the United States from Eastern Europe. They were coming from what was the Russian Empire, and today parts of Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and many others. They came escaping persecution and hoping for a little bit of economic sustainability, the Golden Medina, you might even say. What they found was not what they were expecting. They were moving into one of the most crowded, one of the most densely packed neighborhoods in New York City, in fact, the most densely packed neighborhood in the city. And they are moving into a neighborhood filled with push carts and tenements, crowded spaces never intended to house the population that was residing here. And so I think it's remarkable that they would come together, one community would come together and build this space. For this building is the oldest grand synagogue built by the Eastern European Jewish community. It's not nearly as old as some of the Sephardic or German synagogues that came before it, but this building is just as historic. For this place was a little slice of that Golden Medina that the community were hoping for. And many of my guests, when they're coming in for the first time, will look around and say, wait a minute, Scott, why are you saying this is Ashkenazi? This looks like a Sephardic synagogue. And that's because you have the Moorish Revival arches and domes, the bema in the center, the patterns and the shapes. For this building was built in a Moorish Revival style. It was built by two brothers, Peter and Francis Herder, who had never built a synagogue before in their life. They had never built anything in Moorish Revival. They were tenement architects. The irony, of course, is that they were Catholic. If we put that together, that makes this an Orthodox Jewish synagogue built in a Moorish Islamic style by two German Catholic architects. It's New York in a nutshell, in essence. What surrounded this building, what existed beyond the four walls of this space, was also radically different from what you are seeing here. For beyond the four walls of this building was the congested, the packed Jewish Lower East Side, the ghetto as it was referred to earlier. Over 500,000 Eastern European Jewish immigrants would crowd into this neighborhood out of about 2.5 million that would cross the Atlantic. They were living in tenements just a few hundred square feet, about 300 on average, oftentimes sharing the space with a sweatshop factory or other business. Outside in the streets were push carts lining each alleyway, people trying to buy and sell, both from this neighborhood and from uptown. It's hard, really, to imagine a neighborhood as congested and as densely packed as the Lower East Side was then. The best analogy is Times Square. Show of hands, has anyone been in Times Square before? A lot of New Yorkers in the room? How many of us trying to avoid Times Square? I thought so. For just as Times Square was, this neighborhood too was packed and crowded. There was no room to breathe between people walking through the streets, between pushcart peddlers lining the way, Really, the only difference physically between this neighborhood and Times Square was there were no signs, there were no lights, and there were no guys dressed up like Elmo trying to take pictures. And so in building this space, the congregation was hoping to find something that was a little different, a space that they could have as their own, a space that they could practice their traditions. And they would have that. In September of 1887, when this space was first opened, the streets outside would be crowded with people trying to get in. They were awe-struck by this space, hoping to look at the first grand synagogue built by this community. Not everyone liked it, of course. There were some people uptown who criticized this building. The word ungepachka may have been used once or twice. They were, in actuality, a little bit jealous of the space, something as large and grand as this. Coming for services every week for the major holidays, the community would find a space that they had as their own, a space they didn't have to share, a space that, unlike the tenements and the streets around, had light and air and space to breathe and think and focus on the services. You can actually see physical elements of that right beneath your feet. If you shift your feet to your left and to your right, you'll feel the floor is not level. The dips in the floor are actually made by the congregants over the many decades, shuckling or rocking back. Coming so often that the congregation, in addition to the fixed price of membership based on your seat, also had to do a daily admission fee. Any method possible to help pay off the mortgage. They took out a $45,000 mortgage they wouldn't pay off until 1945. I will just say, I don't have time to get into it now. Hopefully, many of you will stay for the tour, because we'll have time to cover it then. But they had a lot of inventive ways to pay off that mortgage, including that structure back there. I'll give you a little preview. It's not a confessional. Looks like one, though. These individuals were coming to the space, these non-Jewish individuals were coming to the space both to see the building, but also to see the services, and in particular, Pinchas Minkowski, the cantor. In the early 1880s, as this great wave of European Jewish immigrants were pouring in, there weren't yet enough people to populate all the different synagogues that were cropping up. Very few of them were grand synagogues like this one, built from the ground up by the community. Many of them were shtiebels in storefront synagogues, in the basements, or even buildings that had been repurposed. There were so many of them that without the population to support them, each congregation had to create their own inventive way of supporting themselves. And we have in this era what's called the cantor craze. Everyone was trying to get the best cantor or chazan as a kind of headliner, like Adele at MGM in Las Vegas, trying to pack the audience. Pinchas was considered one of the best cantors in this city and one of the best tenors in the world. And people would come from all around to listen to him. Though he only stayed here for 5 years, he would help put this synagogue on the map and help bring different peoples into this space. In its own way, it might be worth noting that this space has always been a place where different peoples come together. It was also a space where the community would come together even after Pinchas left. There were town hall meetings here in this synagogue, coming to discuss secular matters, whether it was the red light district on Allen Street or the issues regarding philosophy and logic. They would invite people to come here that wouldn't ordinarily come for Orthodox Jewish services. That includes the local Roman Catholic priest who would come here and speak. It includes the Felix Adler, who had founded the Ethical Culture School, people from all around coming to this synagogue. This synagogue is also important because in many ways it traces the history of this neighborhood in its era. One of my former colleagues, and I love to borrow this line, once said that this space was kind of like driftwood. And it is in a way. For like driftwood, it was brought on to the neighborhood, like the driftwood brought on to the shore by the rising tide. And as the tide pulled away, it was left behind, evidence of what was. This building grew and was built as this community came into the neighborhood, growing year after year, as thousands of individuals came through Ellis Island. As that community moved away, and as new immigrants were prevented from entering, the building would remain. It wouldn't, however, remain as it was. With time and a lack of maintenance and repair, the building itself would begin to fall apart. The stained glass that you see around you, the roof above your heads would begin to fail. Water would get inside the space. The plaster walls that surround us would begin to crack. The paint would begin to chip, and the wood structure beneath would begin to rust. This image is of one of the domes taken in the 1980s. Decades of damage, decades of the congregation's inability to maintain the space coming due. The lovely rose window behind you, you can see boarded up in this image. And for the folks sitting in the center row, you can look up and see the chandelier, now shiny and brass, covered with tarnish and dust. It would take us 20 years and $20 million to restore this space. And one of my next speakers, Don Ladd, will be talking about some of that process. But for us, what's so important about this space, why we continue to preserve it, is because it is that touchstone from that neighborhood over 100 years ago. It is a space where they would come together, or a space showing how they entered this country, and a space that showed change and history as much as any other in this neighborhood. I only have a few minutes more, and so I'll just tell you one of my favorite stories in this space, a sign of change. For this congregation was always modern Orthodox. They were always very traditional. They had the men on this level and the women in the balcony. They even added the mechitza, or the curtain, to further separate them. You can see the rail from that curtain on the edge of the balcony above. That curtain, which had been intended to separate the two groups to allow them to pray most efficiently, didn't survive very long. The women on the balcony wanted to be able to see, and they would push those curtains open again and again. In 1902, when the price of meat was raised by a consortium fixing the price, it would be the women who would be coming down onto this level, entering the men's level, and protesting on the bima. In its own way, this building traces the history of this space and of the city and its country.
My part of this, my company, Aurora Lampworks, did the restoration of this fixture of the synagogue. As Scott had said, the synagogue had fallen into a state of disrepair, and so about 15 years ago, we began the restoration project. And I'd like to just take a moment now and just point out, if you haven't noticed, I'm sure you have, but all the lights that are in this space. You've got this 75 light chandelier above you. There's 75 lights on that. There are 12 lights on every one of these columns. That's 50 feet. We've got the menorah behind us. We've got the bima fixtures that have 5 lights on them. We have the wall sconces. There are over 300 lights in this space. And so what I'd like to do today is to try to imagine back in 1987, when the space opened, what it was like when it was lit with gas. And so I have a little situation, I have a little a display here. So imagine now 300 lights, it's a hot day like today. There's no central air conditioning, and there are gas lights. And so I am going to light, this little setup that I have here. Okay, great. So I'm going to turn on the gas here. And I'm going to turn on this gas jet here. And you can hear it. Can you hear the gas coming out? Imagine 300 jets coming out, the noise that it would have made. And this is what it would have looked like. Let me get this out of the way. If you can hold that for a second. And then, so this is sort of up on high. If you could imagine that this is like a dimmer that I have in my hand. And this is probably the level right about here on sort of a normal service. So you can feel the heat coming out. You can hear, you can see it, and you can smell it. This would have been very noisy, very dirty, very smelly in this space. And yet I have read that on certain high holidays there would be more than 1,000 people in this space. So it didn't stop them. The heat did not stop them. So I'm going to let this burn for just a little bit. There it is up high again. The gas jets, the technology hasn't changed much over the years. And so all this is like a little piece of brass with a split in it. And that would have been the very similar. You'll notice like what we have here are two different types of gas jets. We have this one, which is called a Hurricane. It's more of a swirl effect of the flames, and this one over here was called the Butterfly, and so it looks more like a butterfly shape. So a really different atmosphere from our central air conditioning. So when flames ignite, there's a lot of combustion, and a lot of chemicals are given off. Even if you just light a candle in your room and you see, after a while, you'll see a ring of soot on the ceiling. That is the byproducts of combustion. So you can imagine what it was like in here. And one particular thing is that brass is like a magnet for this combustible material. It just loves it. The soot goes up and it just chelates, it just becomes part of the fixture. So these fixtures were in a very, very, very rough shape. And I think that this, if I can borrow Scott's image right here, this is what it looked like. It didn't look brass at all. It was covered in soot, dirt, and corrosion from not only the water and the pigeons, but also from the gas byproducts. Yeah, great point. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, at some point when the synagogue was electrified in 1907, they decided to turn the globes down. The same thing with the crystal chandelier in the women's balcony. That way back there, if you can see it, that would have gone. The bobeshes would have gone facing up, but sometimes people turned the lights down to get more light down on the congregation. So it was decided in the restoration process that that was just a part of the history of the synagogue, and that we would leave it the way that we found it, as opposed to, putting it back and turning the lights up. All right. When we began the restoration, it became clear to us the directive was to preserve every piece that was structural. So when we came across some fixtures, some pieces of the fixture of the grand chandelier, or the one out in the hallway, there were some pieces that were so corroded, they had cracks in them. The combustion had just gotten to them. And when we said to the team, to the design team, it would be a lot less expensive if we just made a new piece. No way. We were given the opportunity to fix every single possible piece that we could, that we knew how to do, whether it was soldering it or mechanically attaching it. So it was really a wonderful experience for us to really use our skills, whereas a lot of times it just would have been easier just to buy a new piece. So that brings me to what I would like to concentrate on was not only was the restoration of the fixtures, but the replication of some. Some of the crown sconces over here, as you see, and actually the eternal light up there had gone missing during that period of the demise of the decline of the of the sanctuary. And so that was part of our scope, was to recreate 5 of these fixtures. And I said, okay, great. And then we went to do it, and I realized I had no idea how to make them. And it just, we had never come across fixtures that were so kind of primitive in a way, and so I had to talk with a number of different colleagues, restoration people, blacksmiths, and finally one blacksmith, wonderful, generous person, Tom Ryan, said, well, I know how to make those. He said, you need pitch. And I said, well, what is pitch? And he said that what it is it's a material that the raw material is sort of like the sap of a tree. It's now been sort of manufactured to be much more usable for various purposes. And so the idea of the pitch is that it gives you something to mold and that you can tap against. So we did have one of the original fixtures to work off of. So what the first thing is to take down one of the original fixtures and to get the shapes. And so this is one of the shapes of the top and the bottom of these the crown sconces over there. This is made, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the metal spinning process, but what it is that there's a mold that's made in woodworking. It's called a chuck, and that chuck is the exact shape of this. It's put on a lathe. The lathe spins around, and then a piece of flat metal is on the other side of the lathe. And when they are put together, a very skilled person with special tools will lay that metal down against the chuck and create this space. So that's what happened here. These were created, the tops and bottoms were created through metal spinning. I mentioned pitch before. So pitch is it comes as a hard hunk of material, and so the next step was to melt the pitch. So we actually brought in an oven into our shop and melted the pitch, and then you see it here being poured in to this very mold. And you can see it. You can see the residue of the pitch in here, the red. So think of it like baking muffins, that you have a mold, and you pour the batter in, and then you put the muffin tray in the oven, and it cooks, and then you take it out. Well, this is similar, except that when you pour the pitch in, you let it harden, and then you take it, and then you're ready to do the next steps. The next steps require doing a rubbing. So here, as you see, this is actually a top of one of or the bottom of one of the basket fixtures over there. This was an extra one that we made. And so you see that we took a rubbing from the original one and then applied it onto our metal form, and then with a series of custom-made punches and chisels began tapping out and cutting out the various designs. Each one of these probably has like 10,000 taps in it. It was very noisy to have 8 people doing this. Most of us had earplugs on. So you can see it here. You can see the process of here's the pitch behind, and here's the form that I showed you before, and you see somebody with a custom chisel and chiseling out. In some cases, it's not meant to go all the way through. So there was just right here is just a punch. So the artisan had to tap it, but not tap it so hard that it would go through. So it's really quite an art form. I have a sample in my pocket of all the various chisels that we used, and you're welcome to come up afterwards and look at them. These were chisels that were made out of hardened steel and that were designed and lathed and cut to be exactly the same sizes, so that you could, have fewer taps to get the triangles out that you needed. So here's my baggie of various chisels, and you can see each one is a little bit different for a different part of the process. And this is one where I said some of them, they don't punch all the way through, they're just tapping through. So this one is kind of a blunt point just to make the indentation. Now, if you notice in the middle of the sconces that there is a part that is not pierced, and it is cast. And so it goes like this. So this piece here is really the structural element of the sconce. And of course, it's heavier metal. And so this had to be cast. And this was cast using lost wax method, which is very kind of complicated in itself. And it requires making a mold and then putting in that mold a piece of wax. So this is a wax. And so this is part of the process of the lost wax process. And when the mold is made and the molten metal is poured in to create this, it melts out the wax. And that's why it's called the lost wax procedure method of casting. So it's pretty complicated. After all of that is done, then we had to put the fixtures together, assemble them, wire them, polish them, UL label them, and so on. When you take a chisel and you punch against here, you want something that gives you a little bounce. You don't, if you just tried to do this, it would collapse. So the pitch is just, there are a lot of different variations, and so there was one that was just right and just gave us the right amount of bounce so that we had something to hammer against. Out of all the projects that I've done over my 40 years of doing this, I have to say that Bonnie Diamond and her crew made this project feel like a community, feel like a family. And it was so cohesive, and it really felt like we were working together. And I think that what we're seeing around here and today is evidence of that. It was a wonderful project, and I'm very happy to see that how well maintained it is. Thank you very much.
This is a perfect segue into our last speaker, who is David Mazower from the Yiddish Book Center. And as you may already know, they are also highly interested, and their mission is to preserve the spirit of the neighborhood and the extreme amount of cultural artifacts that have been produced from the Lower East Side. So with that, I'm going to go.
What you didn't tell me is that I would be following a death-defying, flame-throwing demonstration. I love being in this building because, first of all, from everything we've heard, you can see the extraordinary amount of work that's gone into making it effortlessly look as it does today, which is quite remarkable to think of that 20-year effort. But it also reminds me of when I first started getting interested in Jewish history and buildings like this and Jewish culture and indeed Yiddish, which was in the East End of London in the 1980s, when a very similar process was unfolding with all the synagogues and former soup kitchens and schools and communal buildings that were all over Whitechapel in the East End of London. And of course, in the intervening decades, it's right on the edge of the City of London. It's prime real estate. So exactly what has happened in New York has also happened in London, and the vast majority of those buildings have just gone. There's nothing really as beautiful and magnificent and well preserved as this in the East End of London. So it's poignant, but also wonderful for me to see it. So I'll talk with reference to this area, but also with reference to my institution, which is the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. Started in 1980 by a graduate student who couldn't get the Yiddish books he needed for his studies and put a notice in a store window, and it spiraled into one of the most dynamic grassroots Jewish organizations in America. We're 45 years old. We've collected about 2 million Yiddish books, and that was just the start. We have a very wide-ranging mission, but most recently, and by the way, my colleague Zvi Yankelovitz is in the audience here. Thank you for coming, Zvi. So most recently, we've opened the world's first and only Yiddish museum. And the name of it, it's a permanent exhibition, so please come this year, next year, the following year, it'll be there. The name of it is Yiddish, a Global Culture. And that's really what I'm going to present to you and argue to you and speak about today with reference to this area. I want you to imagine yourself as a Jewish immigrant on the Lower East Side of the 1900s. Your day might start with morning prayers in a local shul, perhaps the Bialystoker or the Vilna or the Warszawa, named for heavily Jewish cities, Bialystok, Vilna, Warsaw, heavily Jewish cities in the Russian Empire. Walking to shul, you might stop and check the latest Yiddish theater posters on the walls and shop windows. They might advertise a play by Yankov Gordin, a Russian Jewish intellectual, a Tolstoyan who adapted several plays by Tolstoy into Yiddish. They might announce the imminent arrival of a great celebrity like Berta Kalish, fresh from Lemberg, that's present-day Lviv in Ukraine, or from London. At your shop or workplace, your co-workers might be fellow immigrants from your home region. You might all hum along to the latest hit song from the Yiddish stage or musical, Romania, Romania, or Motka from Slobodka. During a short break, you might read a letter with news of relatives. From where? Buenos Aires, Montreal, or Johannesburg. Lunch might be a herring and a cup of tea in Schwartz's Hungarian Cafe on Rivington Street, or Zygmunt's on Essex Street, run by a Romanian proprietor who despised his Litvak, that is Lithuanian, clients. These cafes often had Yiddish newspapers. You might glance at the Forwards from New York, or the Arbeiter Freund, the Worker's Friend, a Yiddish anarchist newspaper from London. And late in the evening, you might go to a meeting of your local hometown association, or raise funds for an institution. And then if you were lucky enough to get home before your children were in bed, you might hear about their lessons in public school and the new English words they had learned. Dad, it's not Winder, it's window. It's not job, it's job. And God forbid window is a fenster, all right? So here, within the space of a few city blocks, and long before anyone had coined the term, everyday Jewish immigrants were global citizens. What does that mean? Look online and you'll find the following types of definitions. Global citizenship is a form of transnationality, an identity that transcends geography and political borders. A global citizen is someone aware of and understanding of the wider world and their place in it. A global citizen shows adaptability, global understanding, and cross-cultural awareness. Now, this, by the way, is true of so many immigrant groups. And of course, this is not a conscious choice or a matter of principle. It was simply an accident of fate and of history and of geography and of language. And the language was Yiddish. What does Yiddish mean? What does the word mean? Jewish, thank you. Yiddish simply means Jewish. A Yiddish bocher, a Jewish boy. A Yiddish Froi, a Jewish woman, right? So the language, Yiddish defines the language, but it defines also the group, the immigrant group. And what we thought about when we created our exhibition, Yiddish, a Global Culture, was that by the 1930s, in other words, at the most precarious moment for this whole world, the activists and writers and intellectuals and newspaper editors began realizing that it was fragile and precarious, but also unique. And they began calling it Yiddish land. And that didn't mean the Jewish world. It meant a world united by a common language, a civilization that in so many respects, if you were in Buenos Aires or New York or Warsaw or Montreal or Melbourne, you could go on and on. You had the same set of concerns. You read the same front page news stories and so on. And so in the 3 minutes left to me, I will make that case with reference to some of these pictures. Okay. So all of these will be on Abby's website. This I found on eBay 2 weeks ago, and it's an extraordinary image. It's a stereoscope slide, right? So the double image that when you look at it through the viewer coalesces into one 3D image. And I've never seen this photograph anywhere else. It's Canal Street of 1909. And the unique thing about it is that it shows, and this is the thing I've never seen, on these two signs here, and by the way, Abby, feel free to pass these into the, yeah. You have advertisements for the Novorodika Young People's Association Ball and the Yekaterinoslava Young Men's Ball. And these are Landsmannschaften, hometown associations of immigrants from a common town or region that had set themselves up in New York and all the major cities in America and Canada and all around the world for the whole variety of purposes that we know hometown associations serve. And one of them, and so that's the next slide, one of them, of course, was kind of matchmaking and the social function of getting your kids to meet someone from the same group and indeed the same town often. So these are actually my great-grandfather's sisters. This is Esther Rose and Sarah Ash. Now, my great-grandfather was a Yiddish writer named Sholem Ash, and these are his three immediately younger sisters who were brought from Kutna in Poland to New York, to a shul very like this, in order that they might meet hometown boys who had also emigrated. And indeed, that's what came to pass. Okay. Also in the first picture, in that Canal Street picture, not this, yeah, well, kind of this one, yes. So this is a cabinet photo from the studio of Mr. Dorff on Canal Street, and wonderfully his sign is represented in that first stereoscope card picture. The world of the immigrant photo studio was an extraordinary phenomenon. Jewish photographers all over Central and Eastern Europe were often the first photographers in the shtetl. It was a trade you could start up with very little by way of capital. You didn't need to belong to a trade or guild association and so on. And again, this was a phenomenon. Why did you take a photo like this in a studio to send back to your relatives in Der Heim, in the home, to show that you had made it in America, to mark all the life-changing lifestyle events that we know of? Okay, next case. That is a book cover. Thank you. So this is Yudel, the little Jew, a story by Mr. Abramovitz, better known to us as Mendele Moiches Forim, Mendele the bookseller, one of the three classic authors of Yiddish literature. It's published on Canal Street. The publisher is Mr. Werbelovsky. Mr. Werbelovsky becomes, Abby, next one, thank you, one of the founding publishers of the Hebrew Publishing Company, the world's greatest Yiddish publishing enterprise there's ever been, one of the storied Jewish publishers of prayer books, all sorts of novels and penny pamphlets, and thousands upon thousands upon thousands of sheet music titles, drawing from, we heard about Cantor Minkowski, Pini Minkowski, so the great cantors' songs would be published as sheet music. But primarily, this was a Yiddish theater enterprise, and this is a song marking the demise of the Titanic. So it's 1912. These were exported all over the world. I even saw a bookseller selling a set of Hebrew Publishing Company songs from the Theresienstadt Library, the ghetto of Theresienstadt. So this is an absolutely global enterprise centered on Eldridge Street, Canal Street, and the Bowery. We can go into the reasons why this particular Titanic song sheet was issued and the couple it commemorates afterwards if you want. All right, next case, the global world of the Yiddish theater. We have in our midst a Yiddish theater director and actor. Put your hand up. Thank you. Curator O'Brien, one of my great friends and collaborators and a wonderful translator. So these are a couple of images directly from our exhibition at the Yiddish Book Center. These are two plays about Captain Dreyfus, about the Dreyfus case, right? So many of you will know the Dreyfus case convulsed France from 1894 to 1906. It was seen as one of the greatest miscarriages of justice of the modern era. It had a huge impact on Theodor Herzl and his conception of Zionism and why Jews needed their own homeland. It was an extraordinary case that framed the man at the center of it, Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish military officer, French Jewish military officer, who, by the way, saw himself as far more French than Jewish. An irony, but who came to be a symbol for this, for the persecution that Jews had been and would experience. That image shows two Dreyfus plays side by side, one from New York on the Bowery and one from London, the East End of London. One is 1898, one is 1899. In our exhibition, we show a third, which is Captain Dreyfus in Sao Paulo, Brazil, from 1913. This was a play that Yiddish actors toured the entire globe with and kept updating at each stage of the trial, and especially, of course, with his final acquittal. And so finally, and I may be a minute over, what do we have next? Eldridge Street. This exact facade. Now, 3-4 weeks ago, I was in Tel Aviv for a conference. I visited one of the world's great collectors of Judaica, Jewish ephemera, and I was astonished to see he had a micrograph, which is a picture made up of miniature Hebrew or Yiddish letters, in this case Hebrew, a micrographic portrait of the front of this building as you see from the street. I'd never seen it before. I think it's a unique copy. It was made in 1900, that is to say hand-drawn by an immigrant artist, run off as a lithograph. And thank you, Bill Gross. It's in Bill Gross's collection. He was delighted to hear that I wanted to share it with you today. It's one of very, very few micrographic pictures of an actual synagogue. This was a religious art which was repurposed as a secular art in the late 19th and early 20th century. But this is a wonderful and indeed maybe unique image. So Yiddish, not a ghetto, the Lower East Side, anything other than a ghetto. It was an absolutely globally networked, interconnected civilization. And the irony for me is that this was evident to people in this area at the time, just as it's evident to the residents of Chinatown today. But we, 100 years, 130 years later, are having to relearn and rediscover and reimagine this global world. And we find it something surprising. To them, it was just their everyday existence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think a special round of applause for Abby, who made all of this possible.